everyone! For those of you who don't know me, my name is Elizabeth and this is Awakened Spirit. I am a natural green witch and I use practices such as divination like tarot and oracle cards to help guide people. I also bring in other things such as aromatherapy, meditation, yoga, shadow work, life coaching, a whole array of things to help guide people on their own paths to awakening and to also help them heal as well. So today I am going to be talking about something that is extremely dear to me. I'm going to be starting a series on Wicca and witchcraft. Now, the reason why this is extremely dear to me is because this is the underlying practice of all my spiritual practices. This has been something that I have used since I can remember, since I was a child. So I've identified as a witch since I was probably around 8 years old, give or take a little bit. That was the first time I ever did my first spell, and it was with a friend. We were at a sleepover and we did it under the full moon as well. I don't actually remember the details of the spell, I just remember doing it. And the first spell I do remember doing was, of course, a love spell. So, you know, let's be honest, that's usually the main reason why people come onto this path, or at least explore this path, because they're looking for a love spell. Now, I can tell you that love magic for me has backfired more often than not, and this is because of the law of free will, and I will explain love spells and magic like that at a later time. So, for me, my aunt was the first person who introduced me to my first famous witch, I guess you could say, and that's Fiona Horn. And you know, that was what really stepped up my practices. And then over the years I've explored different forms of witchcraft, you know, both the dark and the light aspects. I'm a Scorpio, so I like to explore the darker aspects of things, and I also believe that you need to have a good understanding of everything in order to have balance. So I did drift away from the path a little while, and then I did come back to it, but I didn't really realise that there was so many practices, especially until I started doing this video, that so much of my daily life has still incorporated a lot of the practices that I've done. So I want to point out that I identify as a green witch, an eclectic solitary green witch to be exact, and I will go into more depth about the types of witches at a later time. This is all part of that series. And this path is also such a unique and personal path that you could put 100 witches in a room and they're all going to have a different opinion on what the craft is. They're all going to have a different style and different definition of their practice. So this is my interpretation of Wicca and witchcraft for how it means to me. So this is by no means set in stone. You know, everyone creates their own path, and this is what's so unique about this practice. So please take what I say as just the advice and my personal interpretation. So many people may identify the religion as Wicca and the practice as witchcraft, but to be confusing, you can be Wiccan and not practice witchcraft, and you can be practicing witchcraft and not be Wiccan. So it is a little bit complicated, but for me, I identify the over-encompassing religion and the practice itself as Wicca, and then the everyday things is witchcraft to me. Okay, so stay tuned to the end because I will be sharing a few books that I've had since I was quite young that have helped me on my path, and also a few newer ones as well. They're by no means the only books that I have, because I have got an array of books, but I've just limited it to the few books that have helped me the most. Okay, so first let's answer the question, what is witchcraft? And when I did a quick Google search, what comes up, and you know, as this is the first question many people were going to be asking, I wanted to see what information is coming out there. So if you typed into Google, what's going to come up? I want to see what people are getting. And I was a bit disappointed, to be honest, but not completely surprised. at the descriptions that I found, the first description that came up is the practice of magic. That's true. Especially black magic, not so much, and the use of spells. So this does have some truth to it, and I'd be lying if I said I haven't researched what's called black magic because of that need to understand. But most witches don't practice magic, and in fact most people don't believe, a lot of witches don't believe in black magic itself or white magic, because magic is ultimately all the colours of the rainbow. It comes down to the practitioner and the influences that the practitioner is using to create their magic. Now, I also want to point out that, witchcraft is not Satanism. I do know that that is something that a lot of people come up with, and I know I'm probably going to get a few people who are going to claim it as well. It is not Satanism. It's a practice that has been around for thousands of years. It's a well-respected practice as well. So if it isn't something that you believe in, all I ask is that you have respect for other people, because it is a very, very traditional practice that has been around for so long. So let's sort of get down into the detailed aspect of it. To be exact, witchcraft and Wicca is a nature-based religion that practices magic. So to identify as a witch, it's gender neutral as well, so you can be anyone and call yourself a witch. Some people do identify with the term wizard as well, but that can also get complicated because some people who identify as wizards are in a completely different ballpark to witches as well. So it's a very complicated thing, but don't be surprised if you have heard the term wizard in Wicca and witchcraft as well, because it does come up. You're going to find a lot of people have this, as I mentioned before, different interpretation of what witchcraft is, but you are going to find that there's some similarities and some underlying themes. And these are the deep respect for nature, obviously, because it is a nature-based practice. And I do want to also point out that it's not really even though it can be identified as a religion, it is more of a spiritual practice. And I do feel that that's a distinct thing. I mean, some people identify as religion, more people like myself, for example, identify as it being a spiritual practice. So I do feel that that's a really key point in the distinction here. So we have this deep respect for nature and the cycles of the seasons, and honouring the representation of spirit. Now, for myself and for a lot of people who practice witchcraft and Wicca, we believe in a all-encompassing spirit that governs everything. But, the interpretation of it, and I'm not going to go into detail here because it's such a complicated thing and it's individualized for everyone, the way we look at it is it's omnipresent, it's always there, but it's also not something that governs and creates something, it's all part of one, which is a complicated way of explaining it. But the simplified way of looking at it is we also believe in balance. So a lot of people you will find on this path represent spirit in the forms of a god and a goddess. There is no just one god who rules over everything, though you will find some more traditional practices like Dianic, for example, usually only honour the goddess aspect of it. So it is quite complicated, but for the sake of this I'm going to use the general theme, and that is what you'll find is that there's balance, both masculine and feminine, represented by the god and the goddess. Now the next thing that you will find that will underlie most people's practices during witchcraft and Wicca is the threefold law, or we know it as karma, and that is what you give will come back to you 3 times over. So if you give something good, it will come back to you 3 times. If you give something bad, it will come back to you 3 times. Now, what witchcraft is not. It is not old women or hags, as they're called, with pointy noses, warts, and who worship the devil and sacrifice children or curse you and tempt men to their deaths. or, you know, riding on broomsticks. Now, broomsticks can be a theme, and that is something that I do want to go into at a later date because it does deserve its own video, because there's so much detail to go into about that. You know, so we're not flying through the night stealing children away, and magic is not what you see in the movies. Okay, so I want to quickly explain magic, because if you actually start looking into this path, you're going to find there's different forms of the word magic. There is magic with a C, and there's magic with a K. And there is actually a distinct difference. It's not a spelling mistake, as when I first started out, I thought it was a spelling mistake or a way of making it seem more fancy. But it's not. There is a difference. So magic with a C is the kind of magic that you're going to see on TV or at a child's party. You know, it's the glitz and glamour of pulling a rabbit out of the hat or making things disappear. It's that kind of magic. But magic with a K is the magic of witchcraft. And, you know, it's the practice of spells and manifesting, because that's ultimately what a spell is. It's physical aids to manifest something into your life, and, you know, to take but you do need to take active effort as well, though. There's spells is something I will go into as well. This is just a complete introduction to witchcraft. You know, you do need to take active effort in your life, and I have done a video on manifestation using vision boards, and I will link that below in the video, so you can check that one out. But yes, you do have to actively pave the way for the magic to happen in your life. Now, the next thing that I want to do is crush the belief that you need to be born a witch, or the many notions of how to become a witch, that say you must do particular things, because this is not true. And I see so many of those quizzes online that say how to know if you're a witch, how to identify as a witch, what type of witch are you? And I mean, the what type of witch are you aspect, yes, that can be a little bit helpful, but, you know, you don't need to be born with it in your bloodline. You don't need to be, you know, told how to become a witch in certain increments. This is something that's so personal, and to me, I personally say, if you are curious about this path, if you have an interest in this path, chances are you're probably going to identify with this path. And the great thing is that you can start out on this path and, you know, call yourself a witch, and then in 10 years time, in 5 years time, in 6 months time, you might turn around and find that you don't identify with it anymore, and that's okay. So, you know, I do feel though that before identifying yourself as something, that you should do your research and experiment with things and introduce things into your daily life before you do start putting a label to it, only because you know, it's such a sacred thing. I do feel that you need to treat it as sacred. Don't treat it as something that's just, oh, okay, I'm a witch now, you know, I'm doing magic. Like, it's not about that. It's treated with the same respect that you would treat any religion or any spiritual practice. But do your research and introduce it into your day-to-day life. Things like this video is going to help people to start exploring their path and, you know, finding that way to identify with it. It took me quite a few years to be completely open and honest with identifying as a witch, and especially as identifying with the green witch. I mean, as I said, I'm 30 by the end of this year, and I've been doing this since I was 8 years old. And, you know, even though I've always sort of called myself a witch, it is something that I didn't truly identify with until it had been a part of my daily life for years. And I've really only just started coming out as an adult and being more honest with it, because at the end of the day, a lot of people do feel pressure, and they do feel almost silly because it's not respected. It's not treated like all of the mainstream religions or belief practices. So, you know, it's not like coming out and saying that you're a Buddhist or a Christian or a Catholic or a Muslim. People don't treat it the same way because they don't understand it. Okay, so I want to address the few underpinning aspects of witchcraft that you will see, most likely see. I will say most likely because not every single path is going to see this, but this is most likely what you're going to see no matter the avenue that you take through witchcraft. So obviously the first one is the deep respect for nature and the natural world, and working with the seasons and the natural cycles, things like the wheel of the year, which I have done a blog post on, and I'll try and link that below as well, so you can check that one out. But I will be going into more depth in videos in the future for that, because it is such an amazing way to celebrate it. I mean, the one thing I found amazing about the wheel of the year when I first started discovering that is there are so many times that you can celebrate throughout the year, and if you start incorporating it into your day-to-day life and perhaps start bringing your friends and family into these celebrations as well, you know, you get an excuse to celebrate more often than not, and it's a really beautiful way of honouring the seasons and the cycles of nature, and it does bring you more in touch with the natural world. I also quickly want to point out too that with the wheel of the year, if you're in the northern hemisphere, it's going to be slightly different to the southern hemisphere, and this is the reason why things like, for example, Yule, which is traditionally seen as Christmas this day and age, is so different for us in the southern hemisphere. So we traditionally see Christmas as in December, and this is true for the northern hemisphere. That is when Yule celebration does occur, but because it's about winter, for us here in the southern hemisphere, we would celebrate this in June. So it does get a little bit complicated, and there's so many different opinions on what should be celebrated and what shouldn't be, but I will go into the wheel of the year in more detail in a later video. So another practice is magic or spells, and you know, this may be elaborate spells with different ingredients, or something simple like an affirmation. You know, spell casting doesn't need to be complicated, and as I said, I will go into more depth with spell casting in a different video, because you know, it is an underlying practice of it, and there's so many different forms of spell casting depending on the type of path that you take as well. You know, but it can be something quite simple like affirmations. You know, spells is 9 times out of 10 using your words or setting your intentions to help manifest something into your life. And the last one is the practice of non-harming or non-interference. And many will follow what is known as the Wiccan Rede in this regard. And you know, the Wiccan Rede is kind of like a poem that has been, for the sake of this explanation, that is condensed down to one key point, and this is kind of like the governing body of practicing witchcraft, though not everyone is going to follow the Wiccan Rede, and I will again go into detail with this one at a later date. But the Wiccan Rede simply states, do no harm. So it's do what you will and harm none. So what this means is that as long as whatever you do in your craft does not harm another, which also includes influencing another, then do what you will. So this is where that energy, for example, of love spells can be such a borderline with magic, because influencing another person or trying to draw a particular person onto your path, or creating a particular energy directed at a particular person, is technically interfering with their free will. So this is harming someone. So the do no harm is the ultimate thing that is the overshadowing law, I guess you could say, of witchcraft. And this is a lot of the reasons why most witches don't recognize things like black magic, because it harms people. Now, this isn't just to completely say that there is no such thing as curses and there's no such thing as black magic, because of course there is. But to me, it always comes down to the practitioner. And I'm sure I can go into this at a later date too, probably when I'm doing my video about spell casting. Okay, so as I mentioned before, many people will identify with a god and the goddess as representations of balance of life and the masculine and feminine within all. Some may draw on other religions, both ancient and new. Others may not identify with anything at all. The key thing is that you will find that connection to the natural world and that balance. So this is why quite often you might find someone who practices witchcraft and they might say that their governing god that they deal with is an ancient Egyptian god, or a Greek god, or Celtic, or whatever it might be, because they draw on these representations. Now, some witches may become members of a coven, and this is a group of people that identify as the same kind of practice more often than not, and often practice rituals and magic together. And others may be solitary, like myself, and this is ultimately just practicing on their own. Some people might start off on a solitary path and then join a coven. Others may join a coven and then drift off onto a solitary path. So as I said, you know, you can see with the theme here that it's a very personal religion, and it's a very personal spiritual belief. So it's so widely encompassing, and so many people are going to see it differently. So yes, ultimately the practice of witchcraft is a spiritual practice, one of nature and personal transformation. And it's seeing the magic in the world around you. This is the key thing for me, seeing that magic all around you, the beauty in life, and knowing that you have the power within yourself to transform your life. It's a very empowering practice, and you know, it's so personal, and you know, that's what makes it so powerful, because it's about empowering yourself. It doesn't dishonor anyone, it doesn't discriminate, you know, and this is why traditionally so many women have been seen on this path, because when you look at religion in general, it's very masculine dominated. You know, it's all about the god, and women are lower than men, whereas in this practice and in this tradition it is balanced, that women are equal, sometimes more powerful depending on the tradition you follow, compared to the masculine energy. And at the same time, you know, those who identify as gender neutral, or you know, in a different form, they feel comfortable coming onto this path because they're not going to be judged. So it is a very accepting and empowering path to follow, and this is why it's, to me, one of the traditions and one of the spiritual practices that is becoming more widely accepted, and you know, so many people are coming onto this path. I also want to say too that sometimes this can be identified as a pagan religion, and while this can be true for some people, it's not always true. It's the same thing with saying that you can be a Wiccan and not practice witchcraft, or practice witchcraft and not be Wiccan. You know, you can be a witch and not be pagan, and all of this kind of stuff. So it usually gets grouped underneath as pagan religions, but then so do the ancient religions of you know, Egypt and Greece and Rome and all of that kind of stuff. So it's not necessarily a pagan religion either. It comes down to how the individual practitioner identifies with the practice. So I hope this has given you a little bit more clarification, and I'm sure it's given you a lot more questions as well into the path. And you know, I will go into more detail about Wicca and witchcraft as I plan on making this a big series as well, because this is such a magical path and it's such a beautiful path, and I really want to share this with people. You know, and I also want to help people who are just starting to explore this beautiful path as well. So make sure you hit the subscribe button and to stay up to date with the latest content. But I do want to help, because I have seen so much stuff, like as I said, that description at the beginning of what witchcraft is. I see this so often on the internet and through social media. I'm a member of quite a few different spiritual groups, and whenever witchcraft comes into it, more often than not, it's seen as such a dark, negative thing. And I really want to help people who are exploring this path to not have the guilt, to not have this negative aspect attached to it, and to share that it is such a beautiful thing, and it's not evil, and it's not scary, and it's such an empowering thing. So I do want to help in that regard. So I'm going to finish this with sharing a few of the books that I have had since I was a teenager that helped me in the beginning of my practice, and then a couple that I've purchased a little bit later in life. As I said, this is by no means the only books that I have in my library. I have got plenty. This is just a few of the ones that I really love, and I do feel that they helped give me a push in the right direction with my own practice. So thank you for watching. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below and I will answer them. But stay tuned for the next installment. Bye!
Thank you.